So what is aperture? Probably the easiest way to explain it is, think of the iris in your eye. And when I look at the sun or a bright light, my pupil, or the iris in my eye, it closes down to a much smaller little hole. If I'm in a dark room or very low light situation, well then the pupil or the iris in my eye, or the aperture in my eye, opens up to allow more light in. It closes down to reduce light, and it opens up in the case of low light situations to allow more light into your eye so that you can see. Now the aperture in a camera, a DSLR camera, is very similar, but it only happens and it only resides in the lens part of the camera, not the body part. So it's measured in f numbers, f3.5, f22, f16, and they're regarded as f-stops. Now this is where it gets tricky. If you have a lens, or you buy a lens that has a low f number to a high f number, most 90% of lenses will go to f22, the higher end of the scale, and that's fine. Some will go actually higher. But it's the smaller number, the lower number, that you need to be concerned about. So if your lens goes to f4, that's its widest aperture. This is where it gets complicated. The smaller the number, the bigger the opening or the hole in the lens, and the more light it lets in. The bigger the number, it means the hole is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So as a result, less light gets in. So basically we're talking about a part that opens and closes depending on the f number that you choose in your camera settings. But how can you be creative with this? Or what's its advantage? Why even bother with it? Well, the simple thing is, it affects your depth of field, or otherwise known as your depth of focus. They're the same thing. So if you want to get something that's, we'll say, a portrait of somebody, and you don't want to get the background into the shot, well, it'll be in the shot, but you don't want it to be sharp and clear. Well, the setting you would use would be the low aperture number, and you would have your camera set in aperture priority. So you would go to as low as your lens will allow. And as I said earlier, most lenses will go to f22, but it's the lower number is where the cost difference comes into play. So if you pick f2.8, that's a wide opening, big hole, and you zoom and focus on your subject, you get a blurry background because your depth of field is very small, or depth of focus. So what is depth of field, or what is depth of focus, and how are the two linked? Well, try and imagine depth of field or depth of focus like a block, right? And that block can be shifted depending on where you focus on your subject or on your scene. You can shift that block. Now the size of that block can also be changed by changing the f number. So with a low f number, f2.8, f1.4, that block becomes very small. Where you focus on the subject will determine how much of the scene is actually in focus. Say how much on front and how much behind the subject. Say it's a flower. So how much behind on front of the flower next you and how much behind the flower is in focus is determined by where you focus. You would obviously focus on the flower in this scenario, but you would also end up using a very shallow depth of focus or depth of field, and that means putting your lens down to the lowest f number that it has. On the other hand, if you wanted to get a great depth of field in the case of landscape shots, well then you would have to use f18, f16, certainly f11 upwards, f8 even upwards, and that will give you a greater block. Where you focus on the scene will determine where the block lands and how much of the scene from foreground, midground to background is in focus. Take this scenario here. This is a typical lock gate on a canal. It's actually the Royal Canal. It travels all the way from Dublin to Tarmanbarry. Now if I wanted to get everything from what you can see on the camera, which is the very front of this swing arm here for opening the gate, if I wanted to get that and all along over pretty much the far side sharp, first thing I would have to select is put my camera in aperture priority, and then I would have to pick a big F number to give me the big block, right? So I would be thinking somewhere in the region of F16. What else would I have to take into consideration? Well, I know with F16 in aperture priority I have a big block to work with, but where I want that block is determined by where I focus, as I already said. Well, I would probably focus somewhere around here, maybe here, and it might take 2-3 shots to figure out exactly where works with their setting. There's no person can tell you, well, if you focus bang on there and go F16 in aperture priority, you're going to get everything tack sharp. Because lenses vary depending on their quality, depending on how expensive they are, and a lot of factors come into play. But I would say somewhere around here. I would focus there, and that would give me everything within acceptable sharpness. And I will show you examples of that. I will show you where I'm focusing on here all the time, but all I'm changing is my aperture setting. And one of the photographs is taken at f4, which would be a small depth of field, and the other one is taken at, say, f16, which should mean the block is bigger and I should get more of it, this lock gate in focus. Now you can see in the first shot, which is taken at f4, the white part of the swing arm is very soft. In this next shot, which is taken from exactly the same vantage point, but at f16, that's the only change, the only difference. You can see that the white part of the swing arm is clearly a lot sharper, and so in fact is the sign behind me. Now if I zoom in on the sign behind me and take a look at it, you can clearly see in f4, the first shot, that it's soft, it's blurry. Now if I flick over to the F16 version and zoom in, you can see that it's much clearer. And that's the effect of just changing the F number and making the block, the depth of focus, that block, bigger or smaller. And that's how you can become creative when it comes to taking photographs.